Welcome to Chapter 8 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, I'll be discussing problems with memory, as well as some examples of really superior memory. Take a very close look at this picture. Which of the following four coins correctly shows a nickel? Which of these four has the right layout? Take a close look. Now, the correct answer is C, this one. But if you're like most people, it was probably pretty hard to determine which one of these coins was the correct one. And that's strange because a nickel is something that most people are very, very familiar with and have probably used many, many times. So why is it so hard to remember which one is right? That has to do with encoding. In this case, we would call it an encoding failure, where there is a failure to transfer information into long-term memory. For most people, it's not important to know what the exact layout of the back of a nickel is. The most important thing to know is to be able to differentiate between a nickel and, say, a penny or a dime or a $1 bill, and just be able to know the different quantities that these coins represent. By virtue of being silver, you can take a guess at uh, how much the coin is worth, and being able to contrast it with, say, a 25-cent coin. And so, because there's no real reason to know the exact layout of the location of all the things on the coin, that information never got stored into memory in the first place. So, despite it being very familiar, there was an encoding failure. That's one of the many reasons why people forget or just lose information or are not able to recall information, is that when that information that they want to remember never goes into memory in the first place. Another reason why people forget is due to interference. When there's too much information, or there are contrasting pieces of information that block our brains from being able to remember it or remember it accurately. So there are two main types of interference, and those are proactive interference and retroactive interference. So proactive interference, which is when old information hinders the recall of new information, and retroactive interference, which is the exact opposite, when new information hinders the recall of old information. So for example, you're going to the gym and you go to your locker and you have a new lock for your gym locker. And when you go to set it and go to set your lock, you have trouble remembering the combination because you get confused with your previous lock that you used for, let's say, all 4 years of high school. So because you have such strong memories of that old lock combination, it hinders your ability to remember your new lock combination. And so we would call that proactive interference. It's going forward in time. The interference is going forward in time. So the old information is going forward in time and hindering the new information. Then in the case of retroactive interference, so let's say you have a friend's email address, and that information would interfere with the recall of an old email address. So we would call that retroactive interference, when the information is going backwards in time. So you have some new information, a new email address that leads you, and because you're emailing that person, very frequently now, and not using their old email address, you forget their old email address because it's not useful to you anymore. So information can pass through periods of proactive interference and retroactive interference over the course of time. Daniel Schachter, a Harvard psychologist, identified 7 main ways in which our memory can fail us, 7 sins of memory. And he identified 3 main types of memory errors, in addition to the ones that we've already mentioned. So there's forgetting, there's distortion, and there's intrusion. So forgetting, losing information from long-term memory. There's distortion, when information that you want to retrieve from long-term memory gets distorted or gets altered. And then there's intrusion, which is when you cannot block certain memories out. So the first that we'll discuss is transience. So transience was First largely studied by Hermann Ebbinghaus, who was one of the early pioneers in psychology, a German psychologist who studied memorization. And he described what's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which shows how our memory for new information decays over time. So on average, people forget 50% of new information that they've learned without rehearsal over the course of 20 minutes, and then 70% over the course of 24 hours. Other forms of forgetting include absent-mindedness and blocking. So absent-mindedness, very simply, when you're not encoding information because you are distracted, or you are absent-minded, or you're not paying full attention to the task at hand. Uh, and then blocking, which is also related to the tip of the tongue phenomenon, when you are trying to remember the name of a celebrity from a movie, and they're at the tip of the tongue, and you can name a whole bunch of other information, a whole bunch of other movies or TV shows that they're in, but you can't remember their name temporarily. We call that blocking. Then there are three types of distortion that we'll mention here: misattribution, suggestibility, and bias. So bias we covered in chapter 7, which is when there are various ways in which our memories or our existing beliefs shape not only how we think about people in the present, but also how we recall information from the past. When we talk about suggestibility and misinformation, we talk about how our ability to retrieve memories is consistently altered. Our memories are not a perfect recreation of what has actually happened in the past. We are constantly modifying them every time that we retrieve them. Our memories are therefore fragile, making them vulnerable to the power of suggestion. Research suggests that when police use suggestive tactics, they can help influence the memory of eyewitnesses, and often lead to misidentification of people involved in crimes. In this study by the Innocence Project, they reported that eyewitness misidentification was the leading cause of wrongful convictions in 239 DNA-based exonerations of individuals who were found to, who were originally charged with committing a crime and sentenced, and were later found to be innocent. So misinformation has some very real world, or I should say, the suggestibility of memory has some very real world consequences. And I've attached a video on our Canvas page that describes that in more detail. One important application of the suggestibility principle is the misinformation effect. And this was primarily pioneered by a researcher by the name of Elizabeth Loftus. And she performed a very famous study called the false memory study, in which she and other researchers asked college students to estimate the speed of cars using different forms of questions. So participants were shown films of car accidents and were asked to play the role of an eyewitness and simply describe what happened in the car accident. And the researchers asked the participants about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And they would ask them that question, and the participants would give an estimate of how many miles per hour they thought the car was going. And then they would change the verb that they used in asking that question for different groups of participants. So they would say smashed to one group of participants, then bumped to some participants, contacted to some other participants. And what they found was that the type of verb used influenced the way people remembered the speed of the cars. So participants who heard the word smashed estimated that the cars were traveling significantly faster than did participants who heard the word contacted. So in summary, the participants' memory of the accident was significantly influenced by the type of verb used, or the implied meaning of the verb used by the researchers in the interrogation. I've attached another video on our Canvas page that shows a modern example of this, and you should watch that video before taking the quiz. Now we'll talk about some examples of abnormal memory. So some other conditions that lead people to have difficulties with remembering information, as well as having a great advantage at remembering information. So the first is amnesia. When we say amnesia, that's different than forgetfulness in that we're talking about a loss of long-term memory that occurs as a result of a disease, some kind of physical trauma, or perhaps some kind of psychological trauma. And there's two common types of amnesia: retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. It's very important to be able to differentiate these forms of amnesia from the types of interference that we described earlier. So retrograde amnesia is the inability to remember events that occurred before the traumatic event or before the onset of disease. So for example, someone who has very, very severe Alzheimer's disease might not be able to remember the names of their children. Alzheimer's disease typically has an onset of around or typically after age 65. And obviously, if you're 65 and you had children in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, you knew the names of your children before the onset of Alzheimer's disease. But as you get further into the stages of Alzheimer's disease, you start to lose memory of information that you knew before the onset of that disease. So we would call that retrograde amnesia. Then there's anterograde amnesia, which is the inability to remember new information after a traumatic event or after the onset of disease. So one example is when some people have a concussion, they might experience what's called post-traumatic amnesia, which is a temporary state of not being able to form new memories, perhaps for an hour or longer after experiencing a severe concussion. So it's a confused state in which a person won't have any memories afterwards, but after they emerge from that period of post-traumatic amnesia, they're able to make new memories again. So retrograde amnesia, the keyword there is retro. It goes back in time. You're unable to remember events that occurred before the traumatic event. And then anterograde amnesia is the opposite, going forward in time, being unable to form new memories. Two examples of abnormal memory that we'll also mention are the London taxi driver study. So this is just one example of how a person's job or a person's how someone spends their time can influence their actual brain physiology and help them with their memory. So London taxi drivers learn to navigate the streets of London from memory, and they have to take a test called the Knowledge in order to prove their ability and become a licensed taxi driver. And so a famous neuroimaging study showed that London taxi drivers had significantly greater volume in the hippocampus than the regular population. So a bigger hippocampus would indicate a better ability to transfer information from short-term memory into long-term memory. And the size of the right hippocampus in these participants was positively correlated with the numbers of years of taxi driving. So the longer someone had spent taxi driving, the larger their hippocampus. I'm attaching a video to our Canvas page that explains this in more detail. Another example of abnormal memory is hyperthymesia, which is a neurological condition that allows people to remember an abnormally large number of their experiences in vivid detail. So their episodic memories are for some reason able to be recalled strangely well. And so these are people who not only do they have exceptional memory, but they also spend an excessive amount of time thinking about their memory. So those two factors there are important. And there are fewer than 20 confirmed cases around the world.